Hi, it's great to be here. David was making me a little older than I am. It was my parents who fled Nazi Germany. I was born here, but so why don't I'll start with my witness testimony and go on into the theology which kind of flows from it, which is the relationship between Judaism and the Catholic Church. So let me kind of start at the beginning. As David mentioned, my parents are German Jewish Holocaust refugees. They were both born and raised in Germany. My father escaped right after Hitler came to power. There was a short period. I'm sorry to do this, but is it possible to have some background lights in the room, or is anyway, I'd like to look at you, but anyway. There was a short period when Jews were allowed to leave as long as they didn't take anything with them. My mother was less fortunate, and she was caught up under the Nazis, and they fled to France, but then France got under Nazi occupation, and my mother was actually put on a train en route to a concentration camp, but escaped. They met in the United States and married, and I was born in a suburb of New York City. Very Jewish environment. Everyone I knew was Jewish. My entire life revolved around being Jewish. I had a fairly devout nature, and my relationship to God I certainly saw entirely in the context of the Jewish religion and the Jewish relationship to God. And I followed Jewish religious education all the way through from the beginning of school until I left for college. And in fact, the summer between high school and college, I became a disciple of a Hasidic Jewish rabbi. The Hasids are the ultra-Orthodox Jews with the ear curls and the long black frock coats. And I lived with him and traveled with him in Israel, and even toyed with the idea of not going back to the United States and beginning college in the fall, but entering Jewish religious life in a yeshiva in Israel. But I didn't. I went back to the United States. I started MIT. And when I was at MIT is really when I lost my faith. Now, there were two aspects to that. I'd like to say I lost my faith in the presence of this pseudoscientific worldview, we know better than to believe in God, right? We've come to tell you that God doesn't exist. That could really have characterized the MIT education in those days to some extent. But that's only part of the story. I think the heart of the story is probably I lost my faith because I fell into sin. And I think very often, if not usually, when people lose their faith, they may have all kinds of intellectual rationalizations, but at the heart of it, they've fallen out of a state of grace, and faith is a gift, and it's very related to being in a state of grace. I called it a pseudoscientific worldview at MIT. This is a little bit of a digression, but let me make it. Pseudoscientific because the essence of science is to look at the evidence and to draw conclusions on the basis of the evidence, right? G.K. Chesterton has a quote, which is, rightly or wrongly, those who believe in miracles believe in them on the basis of the evidence. And rightly or wrongly, those who disbelieve in miracles refuse to believe in them on the basis of faith, right? Faith has all the miracles. Faith has all the evidence. Faith has all of the scientific support behind it. I mean, you look at the medical miracles at Lourdes. You look at the miracle at Fatima where 80,000, 100,000 people saw the miracle of the sun. You look at all of the miracles that take place at Medjugorje, you could probably, in this room, find 50 miraculous conversions or reversions that took place at Medjugorje. If this was a truly scientific attitude, it would confirm the Catholic faith. It wouldn't deny it, because it would look at the evidence and draw the conclusion that the evidence leads to, not say, oh, no, we're not going to believe that, we're going to say those 80,000 people were all simultaneously hallucinating, because we refuse to believe in the alternative, which is the Catholic faith. But anyway, digression number one. If someone wants to keep count, there may be a few more. But anyway, so I fell away from my faith at MIT. I went on to Harvard Business School. I did pretty well there, well enough to be invited back to join the faculty. And so I found myself at the ripe old age of 29, a newly minted professor of marketing at Harvard Business School. And that's really where my conversion story begins, because what had been happening was all my life up to this point, I had known in my heart there has to be a true meaning in life. And at some point when I'm older, I will find the true meaning of life. I'll come into life's true meaning. As a small child, I assumed that meaning in life would be found in my relationship to God. And I always thought growing up that at the day of my bar mitzvah, the bar mitzvah is the Jewish coming of age of a young man into religious adulthood. It takes place at the age of 13. It's roughly analogous to the Catholic confirmation. I always assumed that at my bar mitzvah, the veil would drop and I would come to know God personally. And when that didn't happen, it was actually one of the saddest days of my childhood. And then pretty soon I decided the real meaning of life would come when I got a driver's license, or when I got a girlfriend, or when I left home, or if I got into a good college, or if I got into Harvard Business School, or when I started my career, and so forth. But here I was at the age of 29, having achieved all of those external objective goals that I thought would bring real meaning to life. And in fact, there was no point to anything still. And nothing mattered, and nothing meant anything. We just are this random chemical soup that lives for 80 or 90 years and die, and, there's no meaning or purpose to anything. And there was nothing more to look forward to in my life that might bring me into real meaning. So I fell into, in fact, the deepest despair of my life up to that point. And it was in that mood, I was walking alone in the pine woods behind a beach on Cape Cod, early one morning. That was where I found my greatest solace, was walking alone in nature. And I received the single most spectacular grace of my life. From one moment to the next, I found myself in the presence of God, seeing my life as though I were looking back over my life in the presence of God after death. And I saw in an instant everything that I would be happy about and everything that I would wish I had done differently. I saw that my two greatest regrets when I died would be all of the time and energy I wasted worrying about not being loved, when every moment of my existence I was held in an ocean of love greater than I imagined could exist, coming from an all-knowing, all-loving God. And the other great regret would be every hour that I had wasted not doing anything of value in the eyes of heaven. Here I had been so worried about life having no meaning, and I saw that every minute of our lives holds the potential for an infinite depth of meaning, greater than I had ever hoped for, right? Every moment of our lives, we have the opportunity to make a moral choice for good or for ill. We have the opportunity to pray. We have the opportunity to do something for which we will be grateful for all eternity. Or we can let that opportunity slip and in some sense be kicking ourselves for all eternity for that wasted opportunity. Now, I was 100% selfish at this time, and I saw everything still selfishly despite the nature of this experience. So I apologize for the way I interpreted it. But the way I looked at things during this experience was, here, all my life, I had been selfish. And the problem was I had been stupidly selfish, right? If I had been intelligently selfish, I would have spent my life trying to be as great a saint as possible. Because that's the only thing that makes sense, even from a selfish point of view, in the light of the truth. I saw that if I wanted to be intelligent and selfish, instead of trying to be a Harvard Business School professor, I tried to be as much like Mother Teresa as possible. And I saw that every hour of our lives has the possibility, the potential to essentially, I apologize if it sounds corny, but add a pearl to our crown for all eternity. I mean, to do something that we will, in some sense, be benefiting from for all eternity. I saw that the meaning and purpose of my life was to worship and serve this Lord and God and Master who was revealing himself to me. I saw another thing that I had kicked myself for in this experience was the state of anxiety in which I had lived all my life. Because all my life I had kind of thought, oh, if only this hadn't happened, then I would be happy. Or if only that disaster hadn't befallen me, then I would be happy. When in fact I saw that everything that had ever happened to me, everything that ever happens to any of us, is the most perfect thing that can be arranged coming from the hands of an all-knowing, all-loving God. I saw that every moment of my existence, he had been aware of me, he had known me by name, he had been watching me, he had been caring about me, he had known what I was feeling, known what my reactions were to every situation, known what my pains and sufferings were, known what my joys were. And the fact that he knew me by name and was holding me in this love all of my life was actually by far the single biggest aspect of this experience. At the time I thought, and again this sounds a little corny, but it's the way I was thinking, that if I was at home watching the State of the Union address on television, right, and President Bush came up on the screen and said, before I begin, I'd like to say a special hello to my good friend Roy Schoeman out there, I'd faint in my chair. And this was 1,000,000 billion times greater than that. I mean, this is the God who created the universe, the God who created existence itself, who was watching over me and loving me and caring about me every moment of my existence. So I was... let me not leave this experience for a moment, but I was obviously able to be happy in a way that I had never been happy since childhood. I prayed to know his name so I would know what religion to follow. I couldn't put this together with the God of the Old Testament. I know it was the God of the Old Testament, but if you read the Old Testament, the face of God that's revealed, especially to the Jews, frankly, is far more distant and judgmental and mostly distant, because when he spoke to man in the days of the Old Testament, he spoke through the prophets, right? He spoke through Moses, he spoke through Jeremiah, but he didn't speak to the hoi polloi. And in fact, before he was going to reveal himself face to face to Moses on the top of Mount Sinai, he told Moses, build a fence around the base of the mountain and keep any of the people from touching the base of the mountain, because should they even touch the base of the mountain while I'm on top, I'll have to kill them, because I'm so holy, and it will be sacrilege. And that was my sense of God. So I couldn't put this together with Judaism, but I knew I wanted nothing other than to worship and serve this God. So I prayed on the spot, let me know your name so I know what religion to follow. I don't mind if you're Buddha and I have to become a Buddhist. I don't mind if you're Apollo and I have to become a Roman pagan. I don't mind if you're Krishna and I have to become Hindu, as long as you're not Christ and I have to become Christian. So he respected this prayer. And of course, I was praying this prayer because I wasn't ready to hear that at that point. So I went back to Cambridge, where I was still living the life of a professor and consultant, but happy for the first time since childhood, because I knew there was no reason to be worried about anything. I knew that we lived forever. I knew that everything was arranged for our best good, and life had an infinite meaning, and so forth. And it was very hard for me to pay attention, by the way, to marketing at Harvard Business School after this experience. I no longer do it, by the way. But so I was absolutely, from one day to the next, right? Obviously, I don't want to say the meaning of my life changed. It's like in the presence of the real meaning of life, of course everything else falls away. So all I really wanted to do was pursue this experience and know who this God was and know what religion to follow. So what do? Well, I had just had a mystical experience, right? And this was, I figured, what do you do to find out more about a mystical experience? You go find a mystic to talk to, which wasn't a very prudent thing to do in Cambridge in the 1980s. So I looked up this man about my age, who actually worked as a temp typist in one of the consulting firms that I had been at, who I knew was a self-styled mystic. He was a fallen-away Catholic, by the way. And I called him up, and I said, is your interest in mysticism just academic, or do you really have some experiential knowledge? And he said, oh, no, it's very experiential. So I made an appointment. I went over to visit him in his apartment one evening to find out more about this experience and what it meant and who this God was. Well, he put me on all kinds of really bad paths, right? Because he was basically into occultism, into this, Hindu meditation, into, every, crazy thing springing from the New Age. And he filled my arms with all of these terrible books and everything. And so he did all of these terrible things, but one really good thing happened while I was at his apartment, which was he had a book on his coffee table, like a coffee table book, one of these big picture books, which was called something like the 100 Greatest Miracles of Modern Times. And when this man, his name was Bob, went into the kitchen to make us some tea, I just leafed through this book on the coffee table. And my eyes fell on a page devoted to the miracle at Fatima, right? It's the first time I had heard of the miracle at Fatima. It's the first time I had heard of Fatima. So I'm reading about Fatima and how the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to these children and how the sun spun in the sky and crashed to earth and was seen by 80,000, 100,000 people. And Bob comes back from the kitchen, and I'm stunned, right? And I point to this page and I say, is this really true? Did this really happen? And he says, oh, yes. And I say, well, has anyone else ever heard of it? Because here, I had gone all my life, right? I had probably spent about 25 years in school, I had degrees coming out of my ears, and no one had ever told me about the miracle at Fatima or the apparitions at Fatima. So let me start on digression number 2, which is miracles are a really good way to evangelize. And of course, this is a Medjugorje conference, so it's kind of appropriate. But, we live in this pseudoscientific age. Everybody wants objective evidence. Everybody wants a reason to, believe or to not believe. And we have those reasons in miracles. We shouldn't be, I'm not blaming anyone. I shouldn't be saying we shouldn't be keeping it secret. And of course, you here, I'm kind of preaching to the choir. But, all Catholics should talk about the miracles. I mean, it's a wonderful way to evangelize. And, I was filled in this experience when I was over at Bob's house. My initial reaction was furious indignation. Here, all my life, I had been in agony over why, in the days of the Old Testament, did God used to perform miracles and he no longer performs miracles? Why did he used to talk to people and he no longer talks to people? And this was my constant complaint. In Hebrew school, I would always ask the teachers, and they would have no answer, and I would go away dejected. And here was the answer. He didn't stop, right? He's still doing it. It's just that no one had told me about it. So anyway, I left there furious that no one had told me about Fatima. But with this idea of Fatima in the back of my mind, I spent that year, I better speed up actually. I hope that doesn't mean talking even faster. I apologize, but I am a New York Jew, right? I went away with these books which were leading me on all these bad paths, and I wasted most of a year, pursuing them, but with the idea of Fatima in the back of my head. And every night before going to sleep, I would say a short prayer of my own invention to know the name of my Lord and Master who had revealed himself to me that day on the beach. And a year after the initial experience, I went to sleep. I felt as though I were woken by a hand gently rocking my shoulder. Now, I know technically I was asleep. I know that if there was a camera in the room, it would have shown me asleep in bed. But I can only describe it the way I experienced it and the way my memory represents it to me, which is that I was woken by a hand on my shoulder, led to a room, and left alone with the most beautiful young woman I could ever imagine. Just to be in her presence, just to be in the presence of the purity and the intensity of the love that flowed from her, was to be in a state of ecstasy greater than I imagined could exist. And I knew without being told that it was the Blessed Virgin Mary. All I wanted to do was throw myself on my knees and honor her somehow. I'll tell the truth. All I really wanted to do was throw myself on my knees and worship her. And in my own defense, I'll say that if you read either the Old Testament or the New Testament, whenever anyone found themselves face to face with an angel, right, like St. John in the Apocalypse, their initial reaction was to throw themselves prostrate and begin to worship the angel until the angel says, no, get up, that's not appropriate, I'm only a creature like you. And we know that the Blessed Virgin Mary is the Queen of Angels, that she's more glorious and more exalted than the most exalted of angels. So if that is the natural human response in the presence of an angel, how much more so is it the natural human response in the presence of the Queen of Angels? So I found myself in her presence. All I wanted to do was somehow honor her appropriately. One of the first thoughts that crossed my mind was, oh my goodness, I wish I at least knew the Hail Mary. But I didn't. So the first thing she said to me was that she would answer any questions that I might have for her. So in fact, the first question I asked her came out of this desire to honor her appropriately somehow. I think I really wanted to say, would you teach me the Hail Mary? But I was too proud to admit that I didn't know it. So instead, I said, what's your favorite prayer to you? As a kind of backdoor way. And her initial response was a little bit coy. Her initial response was, I love all prayers to me. But I was a little bit pushy. Maybe that has to do with being a New York Jew and maybe not. But I said, but come on, you must love some prayers to you more than others. And she relented, and she recited a prayer, but it was in Portuguese, and I didn't know any Portuguese. So all I could do was make the effort to remember phonetically the first few syllables, and as soon as I woke up the next morning, I wrote down those first few words phonetically. And later, when I met a Portuguese Catholic woman, I asked her to recite all the Portuguese prayers to Mary that she knew so that I could identify it. And to the best of my ability, I identified it as, O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. And when I mentioned this to the Portuguese woman, she got all excited, and she said, that's really interesting, because where she was from, which was the Azores, that was the first prayer that mothers taught their infant children as soon as they could speak. So maybe that's one reason it was a favorite prayer. I knew at the time that it was in Portuguese, in part to reflect a certain childlike faith and devotion to Mary that still existed to a greater extent among the Portuguese people than among many others. And I also now think perhaps it was in Portuguese as a reflection of the role that the miracle of Fatima had had. Anyway, she had said she would answer any questions that I had for her, so I remember being there and weighing different questions in my mind. What about this? What about that? Oh, that's really stupid. Oh, that one's not so bad. I'll mention a couple of them. Let me digress a little bit and say that my witness testimony is at a little bit greater length in actually different versions in each of my books. I have 2 books in a table upstairs. And I'll mention the books a little bit later, but they both have versions of my witness testimony, and I have CDs and stuff up there with it too, and obviously this DVD is going to be available. But anyway, I remember I remember all the questions, of course. Another question that I asked her, which was more of an exclamation than it was truly a question, was, as I said, when I found myself in her presence, I was just overwhelmed by her magnificence, her exaltedness. And so I kind of stammered out, how can it be that you're so magnificent, that you're so exalted, that you're so glorious? How can it be? And she just looked down at me almost pityingly and shook her head gently and said, oh no, you don't understand anything. I'm nothing. I'm a created thing. I'm a creature. He's everything. And let me see what other questions I should mention. I had figured out by this time that it had been Christ on the beach, and that this was about Christianity, and I figured I'd better get up to speed pretty quick. And all my life I had heard about the Holy Spirit, and I had no idea what the term meant. I didn't even know that it was a person. So one of my questions, and I apologize for the disrespectfulness with which it was phrased, but was essentially, what's this business about the Holy Spirit? And she just looked up with a expression melting with love, and she just said, he's his gaze. And then again, several years later, when I mentioned this to some seminarian friends of mine, they said, that's neat, because St. Thomas Aquinas called the Holy Spirit the look of love that passes between the Father and the Son. And I think I'll mention one last question and answer, which was, I wanted to know how to honor her. I just, obviously. And I asked her how she liked to be called, what title she liked for herself. And she looked at me and she said, I'm the beloved daughter of the Father, mother of the Son, and spouse of the Spirit. Anyway, when the question and answer period was over, she then said, I have something to tell you. And she told me something for about another 10 or 15 minutes. Now, the question and answer part of this experience, my memory is totally clear, as though it took place while I was awake and so forth. There's a veil over the part where she wanted to speak to me, and I have a sense of what she was talking about, but I do not have a word-for-word recollection. And then the experience was ended, and I went back to sleep. And the next morning when I woke up, I was hopelessly in love with the Blessed Virgin Mary. Please God, may that always continue. And I knew it had been Christ on the beach, and I knew that I wanted nothing other than to be as fully and completely a Christian as possible. Now, when I woke up in the morning, my first thought was, oh, good, I can't wait 12 more hours and I get to see her again. Because I had assumed that this would happen every night. And then that night when I went to sleep and it didn't happen again, and I woke up the next morning, I said to myself, well, it's got to happen at least once a week. And then when it didn't happen, at the end of the week, I said, well, it's got to happen at least once a month, right? And it was probably a year before I realized it would never happen again. And that was a grace, because I don't know how I could have gone on living, having left that experience and knowing that I would have to spend 40 or 50 years in this exile without ever seeing her again or being in the direct presence of her love. And my heart goes out actually to the real visionaries and the kids in Medjugorje and stuff, because that really is a very serious suffering for them. But anyway, so I had the grace of being deluded into thinking that this would happen the rest of my life. Anyway, so I woke up the next morning. I wanted nothing other than to be as Christian as possible. I didn't know what this meant. I didn't know what a Catholic was. I didn't know what a Protestant was, so I didn't really have much I could do other than open the local phone book and find a church to go to. But when I got to know the pastor and kind of shyly asked him, what about the Blessed Virgin Mary, when he answered less than respectfully, I knew this is no place for me. And the other thing that was happening in these days is I was spending all my free time hanging around Marian shrines, just to feel her presence a little bit and to walk the shrine and speak to her and commune with her and so forth. I'll tell the truth. It was more than that, because it was a grace, but there was a shrine to Our Lady of La Salette not far from my house. La Salette is another Marian apparition, church approved, took place in 1846 in the French Alps. If I had an hour to just give my witness testimony, I'd tell a lot of stories about La Salette, but I used to drive up there probably 3 or 4 times a week. And I could barely make it into the parking lot before I fell unconscious. I mean, the last mile approaching the shrine was torture to keep my eyes open. I would pull into the parking lot, kill the engine, drop the seat, and be out like a light, for 20 minutes, a half an hour, And I'm sure that, was Our Lady's working on me once again. Anyway, so I was spending all my free time on Marian shrines. Marian shrines are, of course, always Catholic. And very often when I would be at one, there would be a Mass going on, and whenever I was at a Mass, I would be filled with a tremendous desire to receive the Blessed Sacrament, even though I didn't know what it was. So those are the things that led me to the Catholic Church pretty directly, a desire to receive the Eucharist and knowing who the Blessed Virgin Mary was. Let me tell one more story about La Salette. As I said, La Salette, this shrine near my house was a model of the original La Salette shrine. La Salette is a spot high in the French Alps, about 10,000 feet of elevation, about 8 or 9 miles from the nearest little village, long winding road up the mountain. These shepherd children were there tending their cows. When the Blessed Virgin Mary, they looked over a knoll and they saw a woman surrounded in this bright light sitting there weeping. And she looked up at them and she said, "Come closer, my children, do not be afraid. I have come to tell you great news." So they approach her, and maybe I'll actually read her first few words. How many people here know of La Salette? Good. Okay, so it makes sense to read a little because not everybody. These are the first couple of sentences she said. She said, "If my people refuse to submit, I shall be forced to let go of the arm of my son. It is so heavy I can no longer hold it. How long a time I have suffered for you. If I want my son not to abandon you, I must plead with him without ceasing. However much you pray, however much you do, you will never be able to repay the pains I have taken for you. 6 days I have given you to work. I kept the 7th for myself, and they will not give it to me. This is what makes the arm of my son so heavy. And those who drive the carts cannot swear without bringing in my son's name. These are the 2 things that make the arm of my son so heavy." And then she tells them that if the people don't repent, there'll be a great famine and all of the children under 7 will die. And if they do repent, the potatoes will sow themselves in the field. So anyway, the original apparition site was in the French Alps. The following winter, I was on a ski trip to the Alps. And it rained for a few days. The skiing was washed out. I decided to take a drive to this La Salette place that I had read about because I thought it would be a nice, quiet place to pray and meditate. And I really don't have time to go into the story. But anyway, when I was there, I had a mishap happened to my car, so I couldn't leave there. There was a tremendous blizzard that stuck me up at the top of the mountain. I had to spend the rest of my ski trip stuck at the top of La Salette. I did nothing there. I could barely stay awake long enough to eat a meal. I slept probably about 21 hours a day. Every time I would, get up, I'd go down to a meal, and I would just make it back to my room before I, conked out. I know now, again, it was the Blessed Mother taking care of me, and I know it in part because one afternoon when this happened, I'm falling asleep, taking a nap in the middle of the afternoon. I say, this is really stupid. I'll force myself awake. I'll force myself to get up and do something. So I force myself up to 45 degrees in bed to wake up, and I kind of lift my head, and I try to wake up, and bang, I'm out cold again, and I fall into this dream. And in this dream, it's taking place in a service station, right? And there's a car up on the lift, and there are 3 mechanics working on each of the 4 wheels of the car. And there's a shop steward directing the work, right? And the shop steward is the Blessed Virgin Mary. I'm the car in the lift. The car is trying to get down off the lift, and Mary is yelling at the car, "What are you doing? Can't you see they're not finished yet?" So, this was a picture, obviously, of what was going on. And then when I left La Salette to go back to the United States, obviously my ski trip was ruined by being stuck at La Salette. This is how I looked at it. And the night before leaving, I was in Geneva waiting for the flight out the next day, and I went to sleep. And I went to sleep with a prayer that was really just a whining complaint to God, saying, I can't believe you did this to me. How can you do this to me? I go halfway around the world to go skiing. It's a nonstop blizzard for 10 days. It would have been the best skiing conditions of my life, and you stick me at La Salette. How can you do this to me? And I go to sleep with that prayer on my mind, and I have this dream, again, a very waking feeling dream, and I'm confronted with this man who looks at me very seriously. He reminded me of like that, really loving high school teacher who always seemed very serious and somber, but who the kids really knew was the one who really loved them more than anybody else. And he just drills me with his eyes, and he says, you can go skiing or you can work for the second coming. It's your choice. Which do you choose? So, anyway, I felt about 3 inches tall. I think I know what choice I made. Which is kind of why I find Let me go back to one aspect of my witness testimony, which I think it may be worth talking a little bit about, which is I mentioned how when I was confronted, found myself face to face with God, so to speak, in that initial experience, my response was essentially, I want to spend my life serving you and worshiping you. Let me know what religion this is. And I said, anything but Christ, as long as it's not Christianity. So let me talk a little bit about where that resistance to Christianity comes from. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about how to evangelize Jewish friends or something. But where that Jewish resistance, I can talk about where that resistance to Christianity came from in me. And where it came from in me is that deep down inside, I knew Jesus. In other words, I remember that before I could speak, when I was, I started speaking very late. I know that might be hard to believe now. But I was 4 before I began to speak. Before I could speak, I was totally enthralled, for instance, by the Christmas spirit, and would feel the presence of Jesus around Christmas celebrations, around Christmas carols, not in my house, obviously, but in school and so forth. And, around Christmas trees and Christmas creches. I think that's one of the reasons why the Jewish community is so dead set against public displays of Christmas, is because on some level they know that Jesus works through it, and that people feel the presence of Christ through it. The first sentence that my family remembers me saying, and for which they still tease me, is, I want a Christmas tree. And I would repeat it endlessly, only I couldn't pronounce Christmas tree, so it came out bibabee. So I would just say over and over again, I want a bibabee, I want a bibabee. And that was knowing Jesus before I knew better than to know him, so to speak. When I was very small, I remember we had a medicine cabinet in the kitchen, and we had St. Joseph's aspirin for children. Now, I didn't know who St. Joseph was. This is true, all I can say. I didn't know who St. Joseph was. I didn't know what a saint was. But when I was really distraught and felt no one understood me or loved me, I would open the medicine cabinet, push the stool over to it, stand on it, and talk to the St. Joseph's aspirin bottle. So I think that, I'll tell one other story. because I want to encourage you to do this. Obviously, my parents had babysitters, when I was very small, and at one point we had this elderly, now I know she was a Catholic woman, babysitter. I used to hate it when she came because we had to sit through Lawrence Welk show. Which isn't really something, a 4-year-old really likes. But one evening, she taught us the Hail Mary. I remember she taught me the Hail Mary. And my parents came home, and of course I'm this 4-year-old kid, right? So what do? You're so proud of what you learned. So as soon as they come in the door, it's like, Mommy, Daddy, let me show you what I learned. Hail Mary, full of grace. And of course my parents just got frozen, and they got livid. And they started shouting at her, How can you do that? We're Jewish. And she just said, it's the Hail Mary. Everybody has to know the Hail Mary. So,
Mary was Jewish?
God knows where the grace of my conversion came from, but I'm sure all of these things matter and all of these things are important. So anyway, I certainly encourage all of those kinds of things.